I'm James Rule. Welcome to the Lonely Leader podcast, where we help existing and aspiring leaders find clarity, build resilience, drive performance, and enhance fulfillment. Lessons learned from collapsing with pneumonia. For those of you that have listened to previous podcasts or that have worked with me in the past, you know I'm a big believer that there is always opportunity in adversity. It's not always apparent, it's not always comfortable to be going through challenge and adversity, but when we reflect on it with the benefit of hindsight, we can often see that as one proverbial door closed, another opened. And invariably, there is a lesson that we need to take from that experience. So I'm going to talk today about a challenging, uncomfortable chapter of my leadership journey, but one which gave me a tremendous amount of wisdom. And that wisdom and insight has actually become so integral to my coaching and mentoring style that whilst it would be ridiculous to say that you are grateful for illness, but I am grateful for the lessons that that particular bout of illness taught me. So let me wind the clock back a little bit and just give you a brief insight into this particular chapter. So my morning routine was very consistent. The alarm would go on the mobile phone. I would grab that quickly from the bedside table, try not to wake my wife. And as I started to creep out of the room, before I'd even set foot in the bathroom, I'd be straight into my inbox. That was the habit. That was how I dealt with work. And from the second my feet touched the floor, I was into work mode. And on this one particular morning, as I stepped into the bathroom, picked up my toothbrush, I collapsed. And the next thing I was aware of was my wife helped me back to my feet. Naturally, she took me into hospital, and it transpires that I had succumbed to pneumonia. One lung was covered, one lung was half covered. I was in a pretty vulnerable state. And I didn't need anybody to preach to me or warn me about the severity of pneumonia, because tragically, just a few months earlier, a good friend of my wife and I had passed away in his restaurant. He was a chef, he was in his early 40s, and he collapsed and died with pneumonia. So it was a pretty hard-hitting moment, particularly as I was in my 30s. I thought I was young, fit, and invincible. And a lot of thoughts were running through my mind. I used to be a professional athlete. I thought, taking decent care of myself. And here I am in a hospital with pneumonia. The doctors asked what my typical working day was, and my wife was politely interjecting to give an overview. And I'm embarrassed to look back now, but I had allowed myself to slip into a state of working 15-hour days, pretty much 7 days a week. And I do not for a second say there's anything wrong with a work ethic, but what I do warn people of, and one of the first key takeaways from this experience, is that an unrelenting work ethic without any focus on recovery is ultimately dangerous. But before I get into the lessons learned, I just want to throw a quick question out, and that is, do you ever succumb to holiday illness? You clear your desk, you strive to empty your inbox, you make all the calls, you scratch everything off your to-do list, you finally get away with your partner and your children, and then boom, you're struck with some sort of illness, flu, gastric, whatever it may be, but your body starts to break down. Now, I can't see you and I can't hear you, but whenever I ask that question to my coaching clients, I see a lot of nodding heads. And that is a warning sign. That is one of the early indicators of a potential risk of burnout. And I was a world-class expert at holiday illness. It didn't matter whether we took an annual holiday in the summer, the spring, or the fall. We would always have to navigate and wrestle with my bout of illness. And the good news for work was I would always be fully recovered in time to go back to work. The bad news for my wife and family was it would be disruptive. So one of the things that this bout of pneumonia gave me was time to reflect. My phone was in effect confiscated, handed to my wife. I was told I wasn't allowed to work for 2 weeks. I needed to fully recover, or this particular bout of pneumonia could have a lingering tail. So I heeded that and took to my bed to recover. Now, initially, and anybody who has gone through a similar situation will relate to this, I was constantly reaching out to the bedside to pick up my phone, to check my messages, to see what my next action needed to be. But obviously, the phone wasn't there. But it took me some time, a good couple of days, to stop instinctively reaching out for the phone because that was so ingrained in my daily habits. And once I got through that initial cold turkey, I started to reflect and ask, what brought me to this point? How is it that I have succumbed to this? What am I doing wrong? And what do I need to change? And so I just want to revisit the point around work ethic. I've always prided myself on work ethic. I was never a particularly talented sportsman, but I worked hard. And it was that work ethic that gave me the opportunity to enjoy a spell playing professional rugby and being able to represent my country at junior grade levels. That work ethic I carried forward into my professional experiences. And in my opinion, it had served me well as I worked my way up into the chief executive roles. But ironically, even though I was working in sport, I was missing a fundamental of every elite sportsman and women, irrespective of the discipline they engage in, and that is the need to recover. You find that sportsmen and women will train intensely, will compete intensely, but there are mandated and periodic recovery periods. You don't get a boxer fighting for a title on a Saturday night and then fighting again on a Sunday. You don't get a professional soccer player, men or women, playing 3-4 days consecutively. There is always periods where the body and the mind can recover. And as I reflected on how I was operating in industry, and indeed, as I find so many leaders that I now work with in industry, that is not the norm. The norm is you work, you meet deadlines. As soon as you've met your deadline, you move to the next one. And sadly, far too many people pay no attention into how they recover. And many leaders don't even take their annual vacation entitlement. So I appreciate there'll be people potentially disagreeing with some of the sentiments I'm talking about here that will hold true to the fact you have to work hard, you have to hustle, you have to grind in order to progress. I do not debate that. Work ethic is paramount. The key difference that I am stressing today is that you need to ensure that you recover mentally and physically appropriately in order to deliver that grind, to deliver that relentless pursuit of your goals. Because if you burn out, if you run out of energy, just like the proverbial battery on a mobile phone, when that battery's flat, the phone is redundant. So the first key learning that I took is the premise that we must focus on how we recover. With all the points I've raised today, I am only touching at a very top line perspective. And suffice to say, if I was working with you in a one-to-one coaching capacity or mentoring, or you were part of some of the Lonely Leader programs, we would dive more deeply into these areas with specific tools and tactics for you to be able to ensure that you implement them effectively. So if that is something that you're interested in finding out more about, please do email hello@thelonelyleader.co.uk and we'll be more than happy to respond and give you more insight into how we can support you in actually facilitating some of these key steps. So where does recovery come from? Well, from a physical perspective, for me, it was a need to refocus on exercise. I had drifted into a mindset that my early mornings were for getting on top of my emails, my evenings were for getting on top of my emails, and all of the time in between was for meetings and strategy and all the day-to-day responsibilities of being a CEO. Exercise had fallen down the priority list, and I recognized that I needed to reintroduce some disciplined windows of exercise in order to help the physical recovery and also, as we're all aware, to process some of the mental baggage that stress creates. Exercise floods our bodies with endorphins. We know that it has a plethora of physical and mental health benefits. So that was the first key area for me, was recognizing the need to get back to that exercise. The second key area for me was focusing on daily routines. Now, this is a huge subject, too broad to discuss in one podcast, but the premise of daily routines is very much condensed down to how you start and how you finish the day. In terms of the morning routine, it's the need for a proactive start to the day. That's the key point to stress. As I mentioned at the start of this podcast, picking my phone up as my alarm and diving straight into my emails was a 100% reactive way to start the day. And once I'd started that, it wouldn't be unusual for me to be sitting on the edge of the bath, responding to a variety of emails before I'd even showered, before I'd had any breakfast, and there was zero proactivity in that. Now, again, that was how I operated. That was a deluded view that this is work ethic, this is discipline. Actually, no, it was just an addiction that needed addressing. So I started to really dig into how could I make the start of that day more proactive. Now, there's a whole range of tangents I could go on here. Not least one was I needed to go to bed earlier at night to enable me to get up that little bit earlier, to create a window that meant I didn't feel rushed or obligated to be diving onto my emails. And step by step, I built out what is now a very, very effective and powerful morning routine that is circa an hour or so in length. And again, when I'm working with people individually, we explore this, and it doesn't need to be an hour for you. It could just be starting the day with a cup of coffee or a cup of tea and sitting and just doing a couple of breathing exercises and thinking about the day ahead. In essence, it's trying to avoid the frenzied, everybody rises at the same time. If you've got children, pets, partners, everybody gets up, having hit the snooze button a couple of times, and there's just a scramble to get everybody up, ready, and out the door. Creating a bit of you time at the start of the day is hugely powerful for empowering your mindset and getting you into the right frame of mind. And I recognized I hadn't had a proactive, relaxed start to the day for many, many years. So that was another key takeaway. Pivoting to the end of the day, the whole focus of the last hour of your day should be about the optimization of how you sleep. And again, I'm staying deliberately very top line. There are a number of different ways to do this, but I had been taking my sleep for granted. And on reflection, the sleep quality wasn't very good. Stress was still very much in my system, and that was disrupting my sleep quality. And going back to my earlier point about being able to optimize performance, if we do not sleep well, we will not recover. And if we do not recover, we cannot bring the best of us into our professional roles each and every day. And as you'll be tired of hearing me say in each podcast, please do reflect as I'm going through these points. We've talked about work ethic, but combined with recovery. Are you recovering? We've talked about the abandonment of physical exercise and how that needed to be reintroduced into my weekly schedule. Are you exercising? We've talked about the need for an empowering morning routine, one that is proactive as opposed to reactive. How does your morning routine look at the minute? And I've talked about the evening routine and the need for the last hour of the day to set you up for good quality sleep. Think about the last hour before you put your head on the pillow in recent nights. Has that enhanced or detracted from your ability to get good quality sleep? And the next key learning from this chapter was around delegation. Now, delegation is the Achilles heel for so many leaders. It's something we've talked about in previous podcasts, so I'm not going to go into too much detail today. But one of my failings as a leader was that I saw my responsibility to protect my staff from as much negativity as possible, as much stress as possible, from any and everything that would induce fear, anxiety, or overwhelm. And I actually have to look back with gratitude to two members of my senior leadership team who actually drove to see me at home when I was recovering from the pneumonia. And they urged me, strongly encouraged, or almost demanded that I started to share some of the challenges that I was wrestling with. Cash flow is often a big challenge in professional sport, and I would try and find solutions and work long and late looking at different options and strategies. And as they quite rightly, with the benefit of hindsight, said, if people don't know the problems that you are faced with, they can't bring their skill, their innovation, and their input to the table. So unless you share some of the problems, they can't support you. And whilst you might think you're protecting your colleagues by not telling them some of the challenges, actually, you're doing them a disservice and certainly doing yourself a disservice because you are trying to battle through things alone when you could be battling through them as part of a team. And that was a really powerful point of reflection for me. That galvanized me to really start to share some of the challenges, certainly with the leadership team, perhaps not with each and every member of the organization, but it really did drive me to be more effective in my delegation. How can you delegate effectively if people do not know with absolute clarity what the scale of the challenge is? And I found that rather than spook people or frighten people with some of these challenges, quite the contrary, it inspired them, it fired them up, and it really energized them. So I certainly became a much better delegator and communicator as a consequence of this. The next key learning that I took out of this was how I structured my working week and my to-do list. Now, this might sound very granular and this may sound overly trivial for a high-level discussion, but I would counter that by saying one of the things I had given no real thought to was how I managed my diary. It was just, if there's a space, put it in. My executive assistant was a wonderful lady, and that was how we worked. There's a space, put it in. And consequently, there were meetings here, there, everywhere, early morning, late at night. There was just a real unrelenting flow. Now, again, I'd condition myself to say, that's me being efficient. That's me being accessible. But actually, it was so disruptive. And I was very, very rarely able to get into deep concentration on some of the key strategic programs and objectives that I needed to deliver. So I started to rebuild the working week. And again, there's lots of detail, and it's very much about tailoring this to each individual we work with. But as a principle, it was trying to avoid the situation where you have a meeting, then you've got an hour, then there's another meeting, then you've got half an hour, then another meeting. And so there's these dead periods all over the working week, and working on a more of a blitz strategy where I would cluster meetings together, and certain days you may be going back to back, providing your energy can take it, but you were in that zone of meetings and decision making. But then there were other periods carved out for email, for reports, for reflection, to allow you to get into decent 1-2 hour chunks of concentration. And I found that restructuring of my working week significantly reduced my level of overwhelm and massively increased my level of productivity. Equally, my to-do list was just one never-ending huge document. That was revolutionized, and I now have a system in terms of how I prioritize what goes where on the to-do list and how that corresponds with different times in the week, going back to the structure of the working week. So again, when you are listening to this, have a think about, is there any planning or thought to how your week looks? Or do you have meetings scattered everywhere with very little space to be able to get into deep work? Do you have a system to truly prioritize and ensure that you're optimizing and aligning your high energy with the most important tasks on your to-do list? Or is it just everything and anything on one never-ending list, as it was for me? The next key takeaway from this chapter will potentially be met with a little bit of cynicism, and that is re-engaging with visualization. Now, visualization was something that I was first introduced to when I was a professional rugby union player. It's very much accepted, And I would say it is standard practice for pretty much every professional sportsman and woman in the world. They are conditioned to visualizing outcomes that they wish to achieve. They are conditioned to visualizing different scenarios so that they are better placed to execute efficiently and at a high level when those situations manifest. Very, very common in sport, also very common in the military, and also in performing arts. You hear of a lot of entertainers, singers, comedians, etc., that embrace visualization as part of their pre-performance routine. So I was familiar with it, comfortable with it, and it was something that I utilized regularly as a professional rugby player. However, for whatever reason, I had moved away from the practice and hadn't engaged in it for many years. Something spoke to me about re-engaging with that process. So step by step, I began to reintroduce that practice, and that has ever since become a fundamental part of my morning routine. And this is another area that we spend a lot of time with people, helping them develop the practice of visualization and the associated benefits in terms of reducing stress and overwhelm, empowering our mindset, and helping us move towards the achievements of our dreams and goals, both professionally, in our professional roles, and in our personal lives. Taking a holistic view to high performance was another one of the key takeaways from the recovery that took place post collapsing with the pneumonia. So, what does that mean? Well, for too long, I'd become narrowly focused on my professional competencies in my leadership role. Again, this is how my mind was wired at that particular moment in time, that I had to focus on the work to do list. That was my professional obligation, and everything else was going to have to take a backseat in the short term. Now, the problem with that mindset is the short term becomes the medium term, becomes the long term. And before you know it, all those other facets that make up a fulfilled life, our physical health, our relationships, our friendships, time to engage in our passions, interactions with our immediate or extended family, all of those are necessities, but they all start to drift away. And on reflection, I recognized that so many of those areas of my life were not optimized. But from that day forward, I made a commitment to myself that it wasn't a dereliction of my professional duty to focus on these areas, quite the contrary. So to articulate that point a little bit further, if you or I or any of us attempt to step over the threshold of work at a time when you never see your friends, you're not working out, you're really unhappy with your physical health, you don't have time for your partner in your intimate relationship, if you have children, you're feeling guilty because you're struggling to be present, you're not engaging in your passions and your hobbies, and yet you think that you can just magically click a switch, step over the threshold of work, bring the best version of you, lead with impact, and draw upon high levels of resilience. Well, unfortunately, it's deluded. If you flip that over and look at the contrary, if you are able to find the time to work out, if you do regularly see friends, if you are fully present in your relationship with your partner, with your children, if you are able to pursue your passions and your hobbies, and you do feel as though you have time for all these facets of your life, then I guarantee when you step forward over the threshold of your work, you will bring a higher level of performance, and you will have a higher level of energy and a greater level of resilience to navigate through the challenges that leadership presents. So that might sound like common sense, but it wasn't common practice for me. And I made a commitment to myself that I need to start refocusing and applying energy and time into all aspects of my life, not just my professional role. And as I said earlier, that wasn't a dereliction of duty. Quite the contrary, my performance in my professional role was enhanced as a consequence. So all of these points are learnings from a very difficult chapter, one where initially I felt a little bit of shame and guilt. How can someone in their 30s collapse with pneumonia? Isn't this a disease that tends to strike down the very old and vulnerable? Guilt that I had put myself to this point when I have responsibilities, not just to my wife and to my children, but also to my colleagues. I was off the deck, as it were. I was in my bed. I wasn't able to contribute in any of those areas. But once that shame and guilt dissipated, then there was an energy and a drive to learn from the experience. And I've shared a number of points today in terms of recovery back into work ethic, our daily routines, how we start and finish the day, how we help process stress. And on that note, another key learning of processing stress was re-engaging with the process of journaling. And a recent episode on the Lonely Leader podcast goes into this in real detail. So I'll keep this very brief, but the premise of being able to turn to a journal and unload, to release some of those thoughts, and interestingly, not just leave it at that point, but the critical benefit for me was as a part of that releasing of the stressful thoughts or the issue that I was trying to find a solution for, I would always find myself writing, what can I control? And it's amazing how the pen continues to move, unlocking those answers from within. Once you actually put pen to paper, I found that the utilization of a journal, A, helped the stress levels dissipate, and B, helped me find solutions more often than not to the challenges that I was presented with. So journaling, evening routines, morning routines, work ethic, building your weekly structure, how you delegate, what does your to-do list look like, re-engaging with visualization. The journey's bounced around a little bit here, but these are the learnings that I took. And I'll finish with that point because learning became a renewed priority. I know I feel fulfilled when I'm learning, when I'm growing. And that need had been neglected. There was almost so much on the plate professionally that finding time to learn and grow was sliding down the priority list. So from that moment forward, a commitment to regular reading and digesting interesting content on podcasts became very much part of my daily routines. I would read every morning, I would read every evening, and I would utilize podcasts wherever I could, in the gym, whilst driving in the car, mowing the lawn, whatever the opportunity was, I would try and consume information. And I found that that re-engagement with learning was another very, very powerful way to help reduce stress and enhance my mental health. So, as I hope this episode has demonstrated, a lot of wisdom was presented to me as a consequence of collapsing with pneumonia. Now, I can now, with the benefit of hindsight, look back and say, I did it to myself. All of these things I've talked about today were not getting enough focus, and I just ran myself into the ground. And physically, my body let me down. However, I look back, and those lessons were fully embedded from that day moving forward for the rest of my tenure as a CEO, and also in my work now as a leadership coach, as a trainer, as a mentor. It's given me a rich vault of knowledge and insights in which I can draw upon, because all too often I meet people who outwardly are performing at the highest level and doing great things in their professional role. But when you start to look a little bit beneath the surface, are at risk of some form of burnout, either physically or mentally, because some of these areas we've talked about today are not being practiced. So I hope that you will be reflecting and implementing some of this. And as I said earlier in the show, if you'd like some more detailed support in realizing some of these steps, then please do get in touch. Thanks for listening to the Lonely Leader podcast. I'd be very grateful if you could share and follow if the content resonates. And if you're looking for additional free resource to support your continued growth and development, then please do check out our social media and website details in the show notes. Remember, quality leadership on the outside must always start within.